Welcome back, AI curious folk, to AI Ramblings Daily podcast by your human AI guide, Michael Parek. Welcome back, and let's get started. Today's theme is it's the week or week and a half of major developer conferences. Microsoft, Nvidia, and Apple are all charting their AI strategies, tweaking them, embellishing them, etc., at developer partner conferences around the world this week. So this week we have Microsoft with its Build conference, Nvidia with its annual GTC in Taipei, Taiwan, with Jensen Huang just finished a keynote there last night, which I'll talk about some more today. And of course, Apple kicks off not this Monday, but next Monday with WWDC, their big developer conference, where a lot is always discussed in terms of all of their operating systems, software plans, hardware plans, etc. So let's get started in terms of discussing what these three events so far are telling us about the AI strategies of these companies that are building up for later this year. So number one, I would say Microsoft is rebuilding in some ways its AI strategy at its Build conference. Remember, this is the company that redesigned its agreement on AI with OpenAI, now that OpenAI is on its way to being a public company soon. And in that context, Microsoft gets to use OpenAI's AI models through the end of the decade and a little bit more. But they're also in a race to build their own AI models, large, medium, small. They're also in the race to continue to make progress with their AI coding software with GitHub Copilot. I've written a lot about this. This is falling behind, even though Microsoft pioneered this category a few years ago. Today, it's Anthropic running away with the prize with Claude Code and Claude Codex, the productivity suite on top of it, and then also OpenAI's Codex. And then you've got other competitors like Cursor, which Elon has dibs on with a $60 billion acquisition post his SpaceX IPO later this year. So a lot going on, and Microsoft wants to really put its best foot forward and then some with developers saying, hey, we have a lot of crazy opportunities with AI models, tools, coding, etc. across our ecosystem on top of our Azure platform. And this is the place versus going to Amazon AWS over there with their Anthropic partnership. We have an Anthropic partnership too. And of course, we have OpenAI as well. And, yes, and don't go to Google Cloud over there with their TPUs, because we have our own hardware chips coming along with the Nvidia chips, etc. So Microsoft has a lot to prove. But the flagship thing that they talked about, and they will talk about today, in fact, Satya and I expect Jensen will be on joint Zoom calls, as it were, together, talking about what Jensen announced yesterday, his major developer conference, which is GTC 2026 in Taipei. And what was announced there was a Nvidia Spark RTX chip computer that would be built with Microsoft and their OEM partners. So Dell, HP, ASUS, Acer, they will all build a line of laptops and desktops that will essentially use this new chip from Nvidia that will have both CPU, GPU, and graphic components, etc., to run AI models locally on these chips. And Microsoft already announced last night its Surface Ultra laptop based on this chip, all available later this fall. And this is important, I think, for both companies, Microsoft specifically, because they already have a lot of good options in terms of chips for their AI PCs. This is a category that they really branded with Copilot a couple of years ago. I've written a lot about this. And this is with Qualcomm that now has competitive silicon that gives you almost the same battery life as Apple silicon laptops, 17, 18 hours and more. But more importantly, with the Nvidia GPUs, in theory, with the chips, RTX Spark chips, presumably it will give a lot more AI processing on the device, with obviously a lot of memory and other components that basically boost the local AI processing. And as Jensen said last night, this would be without the metering. Now, this is becoming an important issue in AI in general. I wrote a post on it a couple of days ago, is that a lot of customers are getting a little bit of a sticker shock when they run a lot of AI agents in the cloud. Basically, the cloud companies are all moving away from, and the model companies are moving away from tiered subscriptions. It's all you can eat to a la carte models, because AI agents, when you run dozens of them or hundreds of them or thousands of them, it's open-ended on the variable cost of it. And so if you basically start to run these models on your local computers, in theory, you have no meter anxiety. And so that is the appeal of this strategy. It will take 2 or 3 years to flesh out, especially in this era of the supply chain constraints with memory constraints from the three major memory companies, SK Hynix, Samsung, and Micron, all now becoming trillion-dollar companies and are moving away from their memory supply allotments on the consumer side, on the local computer side, to the data center side. And that's causing shortages I've written extensively about. It's a Ramageddon, as it were, where the average cost of a computer is going up 15, 20, maybe 30% or more. And this is a trend that will be with us for the next 2 or 3 years. And one of the things with this NVIDIA chip is potentially that being alleviated somewhat because of NVIDIA's huge supply chain footprint with fab companies like TSMC in Taiwan Semiconductor. And so it remains to be seen. There's not a lot of detail on this chip and these computers and their performance yet, how it works well with Windows, how do all the applications run on Windows on top of this chip. All of those are questions that have to be answered, and we won't see the answers probably until later this fall. We don't even have pricing on these chips. None of these computers have been released to reviewers, etc. So this is still very, very high level, but it is a flag in the ground by NVIDIA and Microsoft to say, hey, we're going to basically do this, and this stuff is going to compete with the Microsoft Qualcomm options and other processor providers like Intel, of course, and AMD to Microsoft Windows PCs. And also, it's a shot across the bow for on Apple, because Apple has had good success with their Mac Minis being used for AI agents by developers. And it's essentially the Mac Mini has been sold out as a result of the higher configurations because of this. So that is the core thing that is going on on the PC side. In addition, NVIDIA also had a whole host of other announcements which are also notable, and I'll talk about them in the future posts, etc. And I'll have links if you want to read up on this. But more specifically, they had an open source Nemotron 3 Ultra, which is their latest and greatest open source model that would compete with the Chinese open source models. Works very well with NVIDIA hardware. They also announced a reference humanoid robot model that goes up against Tesla's Optimus robot plans. This device has bigger hand configuration of 25 joints versus Tesla's 23, and has NVIDIA's Groot open source robot software, Isaac software, that allows any number of dozens of robotic companies to take this reference hardware and software like the CUDA libraries and basically build their AI robot applications on top of that. In addition, NVIDIA also announced its next version of Alpamayo 2, which is their self-driving car software, along with its Orin, and now coming the Thor chips, which will basically provide the hardware software elements to almost 80% of the automobile partners out there who want to build either their own cars and or their robo-taxi fleets. So it's not just Waymo and Tesla in the self-driving game in the US. As I've long said, and I've written about this extensively, NVIDIA is a kind of under-the-radar player here, potentially being the prime provider of hardware, software, open source no less, on robots, on self-driving cars, on and then the next thing they announced as well at this conference in GTC conference yesterday was the Cosmo 3 world model, which is physical world model. This is an area also I've talked a lot about this, that the world needs to go way beyond LLM, large language models, and small language models that just build on data, built on human knowledge digitally on the internet. We need synthetic models on how we interact in the real world for our robots, our devices, our AIs to learn about how the physical world really works. And things like the Cosmos 3 is an example in this direction. So it was a chock-full 2-hour keynote by Jensen. A lot of stuff besides just the Spark RTX computers, which was the big headline item with Microsoft. So there was a lot of things going on here. And it basically established an all-surface footprint for NVIDIA across all types of hardware that are customer-facing, enterprise-facing, and from AI mainframe type data centers all the way to local computers, laptops, etc. And NVIDIA has hardware and software options across the board. So they're it's a very compelling story in that sense, comparable to what Apple does with its hardware. But obviously Apple doesn't have the cars, the robots, but they do have the underlying platform of laptops, computers, smartphones, tablets, and obviously wearables that run on a joint ecosystem of Apple silicon, of application software, etc. And to that extent, Apple, this is the third event, they're getting ready for WWDC next Monday. And the news item that came out here is that looks like they're postponing their release of AI smart glasses. You already have Meta out there today with their AI smart glasses, about 7 million of these Meta Ray-Bans sold. There'll be a whole bunch of new models that Meta's planning this fall. Google's planning on releasing 3 or 4 models later this year. So is Amazon. Looks like Apple is saying, hey, we're going to get ready to do a much more thought through set of smart glass options for next year when the technology is a little bit more mature. I'm sure they also want to work through a lot of the supply constraints, because these things also, as you'd imagine, require a lot of memory, a lot of chips, etc., which are constrained in today's environment and cost a lot. And so the supply chain ramping up is an important element. And this is an important little wrinkle on this. The report that was out by Bloomberg is worth reading in detail if you would like to go through the detail on what Apple is planning. But the smart glasses piece is an important wrinkle here. In addition, we'll probably get at the WWDC conference, we'll get more detail on Apple's Siri strategy in conjunction with Google Gemini this year. So those are the 3 events I wanted to kind of highlight at a 50,000 foot level, and then give you my take on this, which is that these 3 developments at Microsoft and NVIDIA in particular kind of set up the field in terms of how operating systems have to evolve, one on the Windows side, one on the Apple side for AI. And that is an important thing that we'll need to see evolve, because AI agents, as I've written about in a couple of posts, almost need their own computers in addition to the computers that we have today that are designed for humans. And there's a lot of technology evolution that needs to happen. And these initiatives by NVIDIA and Microsoft on one end and Apple on the other end are important markers to see the evolution of computers as we've known them for the last 30 years. They're going to have to now accommodate AI agents and an internet almost designed for AI agents, in addition to the internet that is designed for humans over the last 30 years. And there's a lot of bottom-up change here. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not just this year's computers. It's the next 5 to 10 years of computer hardware and software evolution. So that is what is the broader significance of this development. And then, of course, you also have Google in there that doesn't make its own hardware for the most part, other than a modicum amount of Pixel phones and sometimes Pixel laptops and so on, which they don't do yet. But they do have the Android platform. They're merging their Android and Chrome OS platforms, and the Chrome is important because Chrome is 70% plus of the world's AI browsers, and all of those things will run on all of these computers that we're talking about and these devices. So Google is very much in the mix. So those 4 companies now, it's Microsoft and Apple and Google and obviously NVIDIA now with the chip substrate that runs open source across all of this, is the broader picture that we need to kind of keep in mind. And that kind of solidifies the landscape that the world has to look at in a world of geopolitics, trade tariffs, supply constraints, all of those things that are in front of us. And so these three conferences kind of give us glimpses into how these companies are starting to talk about it, think about it, strategize for it. And remember, each one of them have dozens, if not hundreds of partners who work eagerly to build essentially trillions of dollars worth of hardware and software over the next few years. And so this is all important in that context. There's a lot of geeky detail in my write-up and note on this topic, which you can again take a look at. Next, I want to talk about gadget AIs. I talked a few weeks ago about one of my favorite new laptops from Apple, which is the Apple Neo laptop, which is a $500-600 laptop that runs on an iPhone chip with only 8 gigs of memory. And this is making huge inroads into the Windows laptop category, especially for the entry-level school market, etc. And as you would expect, the Windows laptop market is responding to this. Dell just announced a Windows XPS 13, which is their very thin laptop, which typically costs $700-800, but they're running a special now for $600 until September for the school season. And the idea is that you can buy this 8 gig worth of RAM on this computer, basically to go up against the Apple MacBook Neo, which runs obviously not an Intel chip, which is not optimized to run efficiently on 8 gigs, but the Apple iPhone chip, which does run pretty well, a Mac OS with 8 gigs of RAM. And so Dell is trying this. You're going to see these kinds of offers by other Windows laptops. The Windows market this year is expected to fall anywhere from 15 to 20% plus in unit terms because of the just an explosion of memory cost rises and lack of availability. And as a result, these companies are doing anything they can to keep any scrap of market share they can relative to Apple, of course, and relative to their other competitors. And so this is a kind of a case in point on the gadget AI side that I wanted to highlight. And we're going to see more of this, and I'll have more to talk about on this in future posts and podcasts. And that takes us to the questions of the day. Since we're talking about Windows PCs, I have a couple here as well. And one question I get often is, what do I like about Windows PCs against Mac computers? I typically am more in the Mac bucket, but I've owned both computers for the longest time, for decades. And Windows PCs, I'll be honest, I use it mostly to play AAA games when I have time, which is not often. But the Windows computers still have the edge on playing the top games, other than if you want to play them on your Xbox or PlayStation. And then the second question I got is, what's the thing I like least about Windows PCs? And I'll say, where do I start? The biggest thing is Windows 11 from Microsoft. It requires just a huge amount of setup when you turn it on. When I get a brand new Windows machine, it takes an hour or more to set up versus 5 or 10 minutes for a brand new Mac. Just all the software updates. It has tons of bloatware because they make a lot of money installing a lot of third-party software where they make money on the unit of whether you buy it from Dell or Acer, etc. There is also lots of stickers on these laptops, which make them really abominable in terms of the look and feel. So lots of issues that I have on the Windows side, and that has not been addressed yet by Microsoft. They really need to kind of rethink. If they're rethinking Windows 11 in the age of AI, they need to rethink this in the context of just faster responses, setups, updates, etc. for customers. And it's difficult. I know that because they have a business model with their partners where everyone needs to make their margin. It's not integrated like the Apple side of the equation. And so they're at a fundamental disadvantage. They have an arm and a leg tied behind their back, and it's tough to compete. So that is the reality on the Windows PC side of the equation. Hopefully you found this discussion today useful on the 87. The post today I have is AI Reset to Zero 1104. It talks about, again, it has more detail on the Nvidia Microsoft AI PC strategy that I touched on today. And then again, tomorrow, join us for ARD 88 and 1105. Thank you for joining AI Curious Folk. Stay tuned.